My grandfather, Joe Rochford, is an Iowa native from the New Hampton area. He has lived in Charles City, Iowa for over 50 years and has worked for Floyd County for most of his life. I have known my grandparents my whole life, but when it comes to knowing the history behind my grandparents' lives, I really only knew much about my grandmother's side of the family. But one day, when visiting the house I've grown familiar with, my grandfather told me a long history of his family, and it intrigued me. He told me about his adopted and biological families, and this was largely a story I never knew about growing up. So I wanted an excuse to know more about my grandfather's life and from where he was growing up, and to know more about his and thus my lineage. This is St. Joseph, the story of my grandfather's life. My grandfather was born in St. Joseph Hospital in New Hampton, Iowa in September of 1948. His biological mother decided to leave him with the nuns who owned and controlled the church and thus the hospital, as he was born out of wedlock and she did not want to have the baby. He was named Joseph after the hospital he was born in, and he was raised by the nuns for about 3 months in the hospital until his adopted parents, Lillian and Ralph Rochford, adopted him and brought Joe back home, back to their farm near New Hampton, Iowa. My grandfather grew up on this farm, raising horses and cattle. He went to school at New Hampton No. 1 Rural Schoolhouse, which is now residing in Fredericksburg, Iowa. But it resided in the countryside near Boyd when it was originally constructed. These schoolhouses were lawfully required to be 6 miles apart and to house all grades, K through 12. It was like this until 1958, when my grandfather was 10. This is when the last class of these schools either graduated or were consolidated into elementary schools, junior high schools, and high schools, which is where my grandfather ended up finishing his schooling. My grandpa graduated from New Hampton High School and worked for a construction company in New Hampton for about 1 year. While working for them, he helped rebuild the new St. Joseph Hospital, which is the one that stands in New Hampton today, and also built the new high school, which is the one that also stands today. After this year-long stint in construction, my grandfather went to Hawkeye Community College for 2 years and then transferred to UNI to finish his degree in math education. Around this time, he also met my grandmother, who went to UNI for elementary education. She and my grandfather lived in an apartment right outside of campus that is now Campus Ministries. They lived there for about 2 years while they finished their degrees. After graduating, my grandfather took a job with the county, and my grandmother found a teaching job in Charles City, and they decided to move there and live out their lives. This is where my aunt and father grew up, and this is where my grandparents still live today. My grandfather always knew that he had been adopted his whole life.
No, all my mother ever told me was the fact that, I was adopted, and the reason I was adopted was that my mother couldn't take care of me. And there was no question or reference to my father at all. So at that point, I didn't think that they really knew who the father was. And I didn't know if they knew my mother or not. But
2 main things would be stopping him, though. He didn't want to make his mother and father think they weren't good enough for him, especially his mother. He cared a lot about her and never really delved into the topic until their passing. The other was medical records. Knowing history for pre-existing conditions or anything that was known to be a problem in our bloodline. So around the early 2000s, my grandfather began to research heavily into his ancestry, finding bits and pieces throughout the way. What cracked the nut open, though, was
a funeral of my adopted uncle, and was discussing my adoption with another uncle on the way home. And actually, my wife Marilyn asked his wife, which would be my aunt, if she knew anything about my adoption. And she said, well, I think I do. But you all got to come into my house, our house. We'll have a cup of coffee, and we'll talk this over about what they knew.
My grandfather was intrigued and decided to meet the eldest brother, Lee. At around this time, my grandfather followed a long trail of stories, eventually leading him to the place where his biological mother and father had lived, near Alpha, Iowa. At the highest point in Chickasaw County, his biological mother, Rowena Martin, was one of 4 sisters who lived on that land with their grandmother. His biological father, Raymond Hager, lived just down the road. He was married and had 3 kids at the time. Rowena did work around their house and took care of her grandmother, who she lived with. She didn't have much more than a high school education, so she stuck around at home. Rowena would go down the road to the Hager's farm to help them with taking care of the kids and doing some work around their farm. Eventually, Ray and Rowena would go out to dances around the area in Sumner and Fredericksburg as a pastime.
Kind of how it got started is mother didn't like to wash the separator and the milk machine, so Rowena always went down and did that while mother was taking care of the little baby. And Dad and Rowena both liked to dance, and they go to dances while mother would sit and take care of the kid, little Ellen and Lois. And
Eventually, one day, as Lee remembers it, they suddenly stopped seeing Rowena around the farm, and they were told to stop playing with the neighbor kids up the hill. Lee remembers hearing that one of the Martin girls had gotten pregnant, but doesn't remember much more than that, and he went on with his life, becoming a successful farmer around the Alpha area just as his father had done.
And well, she had a baby, and well, where's the baby?
Yeah.
And I don't know, Joe said. He didn't know where it was. And
Rowena was basically banished from being outside or being seen during this time of her being pregnant with my grandfather. It was a much bigger deal back then to have a child out of wedlock, and she did not want to be seen pregnant around the area. She remained in hiding until giving birth at St. Joseph's Hospital in New Hampton, where she decided to give him to the nuns, and left. At this point, not much is known about Rowena's life after giving birth to my grandfather. We know that she died of lung cancer at the age of 50 from being a heavy smoker and was buried in Prairie du Chien. Ray Hager continued to live on the farm and died right before my grandfather was starting to piece together his ancestry. Because of Ray Hager's immense wealth from farming, 2 of the 4 Hager siblings have not accepted my grandfather for who he's claiming to be. They are under the impression that their father would never have an affair and have a child outside of their family. Lee, however, put this aside and completely accepted my grandfather for who he is, a brother. They talk almost every day, and my grandmother says that they talk so much it's as if they're making up for lost time. The story of my grandfather's life is a story of heartbreak and triumph over hate. He is one of a kind and the best grandfather anyone could ask for. My dad's letter to my grandfather puts his character best. I love you, Grandpa, and thank you for sharing this great story with me. As I'm becoming a father myself, I'm realizing how challenging being a dad can be. As time goes by, I appreciate more and more the good job you did being my father. Every day I find myself doing all the things you've taught me, all the lessons you've shown me. Every time I wonder if I'm doing a good job being a father, I'll remember all the times Miles has said, "You're just like Grandpa Joe," and I'll know I'm doing a great job being a dad. Thank you for being a great dad. Love you, Matt.